Supper that first night was a quiet, careful affair, the children eating with the studied restraint of people who have learned that food offered can be food withdrawn, and Thomas eating almost nothing at all, watching his children's plates more than his own. Martha noticed this and said nothing, only refilled the bread plate twice without comment, and let the silence do the talking that none of them were ready to do yet. Ruth watched from the doorway with her arms crossed and her mouth set in the particular line she reserved for decisions she considered reckless, and later, after the Hargroves had gone out to the bunkhouse and the lamp there had gone dark, she cornered Martha at the wash basin and told her, in the low, urgent voice of a woman delivering a warning she believed to be a kindness, that a widow alone could not go taking in strange men off the road, that people would talk, that people were already inclined to talk about a woman who ran 300 acres without a husband to answer for her, and that this, a strange man and 4 strange children installed in the bunkhouse, would give them a great deal more to talk about than Martha could afford. Martha dried her hands slowly and did not raise her voice, because raising her voice was not her way, but she said that she had heard enough talk in 2 years to fill a church twice over, and that not one word of it had put a meal on her table or a roof over the hay barn that leaked every spring, and that she reckoned she would rather be talked about for kindness than for the alternative. Ruth did not have an answer for that, and she went to bed with her disapproval intact, but her argument spent. In the morning, Thomas Hargrove was up before the sun, and when Martha came out to the barn with the milking pail, she found the hay already turned, the water troughs already filled, and the loose board on the chicken coop, the one she had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks and had not gotten to, already mended, with a neatness of joinery that told her something about the kind of man he had been before the road wore him down. He did not announce any of this. He was simply there, working, and when she came upon him he straightened and waited, the way a man waits to be told whether his work has been acceptable. And there was something in that waiting, that willingness to be judged and found wanting, that told Martha more about what he had been through than any story he might have told her over supper. She told him the board looked fine. He nodded once, like a man receiving a verdict, and went back to work. That was how the arrangement began, without a formal word spoken between them, the way some of the truest arrangements do, not with a contract but with a demonstration, each of them showing the other, through the plain evidence of labor and shelter given and received, what could be trusted. The first weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Martha with how quickly it settled into something like peace. Thomas worked from dark to dark, and worked well, with the quiet, economical competence of a man who had once run something larger than a hired hand's chores. She noticed the way he assessed a fence line before he touched it, the way he read weather in the color of the western sky before she had even glanced up herself, and she filed these observations away without asking about them, because she had learned that some men's past came out only when coaxed by patience and never by questions. The children found their own rhythms too. Sarah attached herself to the kitchen and the henhouse with the fierce competence of a girl who had been managing a household long before she had any right to be doing so, and Martha watched her one afternoon straighten a stack of plates with the tight, controlled movements of someone bracing for criticism that never came, and Martha said gently that she had done fine work and that Sarah did not need to do the work of a grown woman, when there was a grown woman right there to share it, and Sarah's chin had wobbled, just slightly, before she caught it and steadied it and said she didn't mind. Daniel, for his part, picked fights, with the rooster, with the woodpile, with his own boots when they would not come off fast enough, and Martha let him mostly, because she recognized in his temper the particular shape of a boy who had been told to be strong before he had been allowed to be sad. And she knew better than to try to talk a boy like that out of his anger before he was ready to set it down himself. Ellie said nothing, day after day, but she watched everything, and she began, in the second week, to leave small carvings around the farmhouse, a bird on the windowsill, a flower on the porch rail, a tiny rough-hewn dog left on the seat of Martha's chair at the kitchen table, and Martha understood, without being told, that this was the girl's way of speaking, and she began leaving small things back, a ribbon, a smooth river stone, a biscuit set just for her at the corner of the table, and slowly, so slowly that Martha almost missed the moment it happened, Ellie began to sit closer at supper and to lean, just slightly, against Martha's arm when the evening reading was done. It was the baby who broke first, in the good way, the way a fever breaks. Jonah had cried through most nights for the first 2 weeks, a thin, unhappy sound that Martha heard through the walls and that kept her lying awake listening for it to stop. And one night, when the crying went on longer than usual, and she heard Thomas's low, exhausted voice trying and failing to soothe him, she got up without deciding to, pulled her shawl over her nightdress, and walked out to the bunkhouse in the dark. Thomas opened the door with the baby against his shoulder, and an apology already forming on his face. But Martha did not wait for it. She held out her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, the particular hesitation of a man unused to being helped, he handed the child over, and Martha walked him in slow circles around the small room, humming something low and wordless that she had not hummed since her own mother sang it to her, and the baby, worn down to nothing by his own crying, finally slept. Thomas watched her from the narrow bed, his elbows on his knees, and he said, so quietly she almost missed it, that he did not know how to thank her for what she had done for his children, that he had walked 300 miles, believing there was no kindness left in the world large enough for 5 hungry strangers, and that he had been wrong. And that being wrong about that particular thing was the finest kind of wrong a man could be. Martha, still swaying slightly with the sleeping baby, told him that kindness was not so rare as he believed, only that it was rationed out to people who looked like they deserved it, and that she had made up her mind a long time ago not to ration hers that way. Thomas did not answer for a long moment, and when he did, his voice had gone rough. He said his wife Anna had died delivering Jonah, and that he had spent the 18 months since trying to be a father and a mother, both to 4 children, and failing at both jobs at once, and that the farm they'd had, a good farm once, in another county, had gone under while he was too grief-stricken to notice the books going bad. And that pride had kept him from asking anyone for help, until pride was the only thing he had left to lose, and even that had finally given out on the fence line in the rain. He stopped there, the way she noticed he often stopped, right at the edge of the tender part, as though some old wound had taught him that the vulnerable half of a sentence was the half most likely to get a man hurt. Martha did not push him further. She only said that grief did not make a man weak, and that the fact he had kept walking, kept his children fed and clothed, and carried 300 miles on will alone, told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was, and that she reckoned Anna would be proud of him if pride was a thing the dead could still feel. Thomas put his face in his hands then, just for a moment, and Martha pretended not to see it because she understood, better than most, that some tears needed privacy, even inside a room with another person in it. The first real trial came in the 4th week, in the shape of Mrs. Cordelia Pruitt, who arrived at the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon in a carriage too fine for the muddy county road, bearing a basket of preserves that Martha understood immediately to be a Trojan horse for something far less generous than fruit. Mrs. Pruitt was the wife of the town's leading merchant, and she had appointed herself, some years back, the unofficial custodian of the county's moral temperature, a role she discharged with the tireless energy of a woman who had never once had to worry where her next meal was coming from. She sat in Martha's front room with her basket on her lap and her eyes moving over every detail of the house, the mended curtains, the plain furniture, the small carved animals lined up along the windowsill, with the particular expression of a woman cataloging evidence. She said she had come as a friend to express concern, the way women like Mrs. Pruitt always prefaced cruelty with the word concern, as though the word itself were a kind of absolution. She said it had come to her attention that Martha was harboring a man of unknown character and his 4 children in her bunkhouse, unmarried, unchaperoned, but for the sister who everyone knew hardly counted, and that people were beginning to talk, and that she felt it her Christian duty to warn Martha before the talk did permanent damage to a reputation that a widow alone could ill afford to lose. Martha sat very still through this entire speech, her hands folded in her lap, and when it was finished she said, in a voice so calm it seemed to surprise even Mrs. Danton Pruitt, that she was grateful for the concern, and that she would consider it exactly as much as the concern deserved, which was to say, not at all, because a man's character was proven in a barn at 5 in the morning and not in a parlor over preserves, and that she had watched Thomas Hargrove's character proven every single day for 4 weeks running, while the rest of the county had done nothing but talk. Mrs. Pruitt's mouth thinned to a line, and she said with the particular venom of a woman unused to being refused that Martha would find out soon enough what talk could do to a woman's standing, and that she hoped, for the children's sake, if not Martha's own, that Martha's charity would not prove to be a very expensive mistake. She left without touching her tea. The talk, as Mrs. Metairie Pruitt had promised, did not take long to arrive, and it arrived first and worst at the general store, where Sarah had gone with a short list and a few careful coins to buy flour and thread, and where she overheard, before anyone realized she was listening, 2 women discussing in low, delighted voices the scandal of the widow Coyle and her live-in farmhand, speculating in a manner that made even the store's proprietor look uncomfortable, wondering aloud what kind of woman would take in a strange man with children not her own, unless there was something improper in it, wondering whether the children were even his, wondering. And this was the part that made Sarah's face go white and then red, whether a man who had lost a farm and a wife inside 2 years could be trusted around a woman's money and land at all. Sarah did not buy the flour. She walked the 2 miles home with her chin up and her eyes dry, because she had learned a long time ago that crying in public cost something she could not afford to spend, and it was only when she reached the farmhouse and found Martha in the kitchen that the whole story came out of her in a rush. Frightened voice entirely unlike her usual composed one, whether they would have to leave now, whether Martha's kindness was about to run out the way every other kindness in Sarah's short life had run out just when she'd started to trust it. Martha knelt down in front of her, an effort, for a woman of her size and her years of hard labor, but she did it anyway, because she understood that some conversations needed to happen at eye level, and she told Sarah plainly, the way she told everyone plain, unsentimental truths, lay gently on the counter, that this was her land and her house and her decision, and that no amount of talk from women with nothing better to occupy their Sundays was going to change her mind about who belonged under her roof. She said that Sarah and her brother and sisters were not going anywhere, that this was home now for as long as they needed it to be, and that if the town wanted something to talk about, she would be glad to give them something worth talking about. Sarah, who had held herself together through 300 miles of road and 18 months of being the only steady hand in a household coming apart at the seams, finally let herself cry, right there in the kitchen, and Martha held her the way she imagined a mother might, and did not tell her to stop. The second trial came harder and colder in the form of a letter from Mr. Dobla, Everett Kessler at the county bank, delivered by a boy on a bicycle on a Tuesday morning, informing Martha that in light of certain irregularities that had come to the bank's attention regarding the character of persons residing on the mortgaged property, the bank was reconsidering the terms of her loan and requesting a meeting at her earliest convenience to discuss acceleration of the note. Martha read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and though her face gave away almost nothing, Thomas, coming in from the fields and catching sight of her stillness, knew immediately that something had gone wrong, and when she told him, he went very quiet, in the particular way she now recognized as the sound of a man blaming himself for a stranger's cruelty. He said low and rough that he should leave, that he and the children had brought this trouble to her door, and he would not let his presence cost her the land she had fought so hard to keep. And he began right there in the kitchen to talk himself into walking away from the first safety his family had found in 18 months. The hard way that his presence in a place tended to precede its ruin. Martha stood up from the table so fast her chair scraped the floor, and she said, with more heat in her voice than she had allowed herself in 2 years, that she had not taken him in to hand him back to the road the first time some small-hearted man with a mortgage book tried to bully her, and that if he thought one letter from Everett Kessler was enough to make her go back on her word, then he had badly misjudged the kind of woman she was. She said the bank did not have grounds to accelerate a note that had been paid on time, every time, for 2 years running, and that Kessler knew it, and that this letter was not about irregularities at all. It was about a man who had wanted this land for himself since before Alias died, and had been looking for a lever to pry it loose from her ever since. She said she intended to go into town and tell him so to his face. Thomas, startled out of his self-recrimination by the force of her conviction, said he would go with her, and Martha, who had walked into that bank alone more times than she cared to count, and had never once had anyone stand beside her while she did it, found that she did not want to refuse him. They rode into town together the next morning, and word of their arrival at the bank moved through the streets faster than the wagon itself, so that by the time Martha walked into Kessler's office with Thomas a half-step behind her, a small crowd of the curious and the delighted had already gathered on the boardwalk outside. Pruitt, prominent among them, her expression arranged into something like satisfaction, as though she had ordered this confrontation up herself and was now waiting to be served the results. Kessler sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled and his smile carefully neutral, and he began, in the same gentle, condescending tone he had used 2 years before, to explain that the bank had a responsibility to its depositors, that a woman in Martha's position, unmarried, running a large property, now with an unrelated man and his children installed on the premises, presented a certain kind of risk that the bank could not simply overlook, that perhaps it would be best for everyone if Martha considered selling the North acreage at a fair price. Of course, a price he happened to be prepared to offer that very morning. Martha let him finish. She had learned, over 2 years of dealing with men like Kessler, that the worst thing she could do was interrupt them, because men like Kessler mistook a woman's patience for a lack of preparation, and she had come prepared. She reached into her bag and set on his desk one by one 2 years of receipts, every mortgage payment made on time, every interest installment paid in full, the deed itself with Elias's signature and her own beside it, and a copy of the county code regarding wrongful acceleration of a performing note, which she had spent the previous evening at the kitchen table copying out by lamplight, while Thomas held Jonah on his knee and watched her with an expression she did not have a name for yet. She said, in the same plain voice she used for everything, that the bank had no legal grounds to call the note, that she had documentation of every payment to prove it, and that if Mr. Kessler wished to pursue this further, she would be glad to bring the matter before the circuit judge when he came through in 3 weeks' time, along with a letter to the State Banking Commission regarding a pattern of pressure applied specifically to unmarried women landholders in this county. Pattern she suspected she was not the only one who could document. Kessler's smile did not so much fade as collapse, and in the silence that followed, Thomas, who had said nothing throughout the entire meeting, understanding correctly that this was Martha's fight to win on her own terms, finally spoke. And what he said was short, and it was the kind of short, plain declaration that Martha would remember for the rest of her life. He said that he had walked 300 miles with 4 children because he had nowhere else safe to bring them, and that in 4 weeks under Martha Coyle's roof, he had watched a woman work harder and treat people more fairly than any man he had ever called an employer, and that if Mr. Kessler wanted to talk about character, he ought to start by examining his own. Kessler had no answer for that either, and Martha and Thomas walked out of the bank together into the gathered crowd on the boardwalk, and it was old Silas Reeves, who had farmed the county for 50 years and buried 2 wives and outlasted 3 bank presidents, who broke the silence by saying, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that he had known Elias Coyle since they were boys, and that Elias would be prouder of his widow this morning than he had been of anything in his own lifetime, and that anyone in this town who had a word to say against Martha Coyle's judgment could say it to him first. Mrs. Pruitt, for the first time in living memory, had nothing to say at all. The land was safe, but the winter that followed tested them in a different way. in the way that has nothing to do with banks or gossip, and everything to do with the body's own frailty. Ellie fell ill in February, a fever that climbed and would not break, and for 3 days the household moved around her sickbed in a hushed, frightened choreography, Martha and Thomas taking turns through the night pressing cool cloths to her small forehead. Sarah keeping the younger children fed and quiet, with a competence that broke Martha's heart a little more each time she saw it. Daniel sitting silent and pale on the floor outside the sickroom door, his anger for once entirely absent, replaced by a fear too large for a 9-year-old's chest. Doc Bennett came out from town on the second day and said in the careful voice doctors use when they do not yet know which way a thing will break, that they would have to wait it out, that there was little more medicine could do, besides keep her comfortable and watch. It was on the 3rd night, when the fever seemed at its worst, that Ellie, delirious and frightened, spoke for the first time in the 4 months since Martha had known her. Not a word, not yet, but a sound, a small broken cry for her mother, and Thomas, sitting at her bedside, made a sound himself that Martha had never heard a grown man make. A sound with no bottom to it, the same shape as the baby's crying on that first rainy night at the fence line. Martha came and sat beside him, and she did not say anything comforting, because there was nothing comforting to say to a man watching his child call for a mother who could not come, and instead she simply put her hand over his where it rested on the coverlet, and she stayed there through the rest of the night, and somewhere near dawn the fever broke, and Ellie slept true and peaceful for the first time in 3 days, and Thomas wept then, openly, not bothering to hide it, and Martha did not look away because she understood that this was a moment that deserved to be witnessed, not endured alone. It was 2 mornings later, with Ellie sitting up in bed and eating broth with the particular fierce appetite of a child returning to herself, that she said her first full sentence in 4 months, looking at Martha with her father's same watchful eyes, and what she said was "Thank you for staying." Playing on the floor with a wooden spoon seemed to sense the weight of it. Martha had to leave the room for a moment after that, out onto the porch in the cold February air, because there were some things even her rule could not hold back, and it was Thomas who found her there, her shoulders shaking silently, and instead of pretending not to notice the way she had spent 2 years training everyone around her to do, he simply stood beside her at the porch rail, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, and he did not say anything at all because he had learned by then that some of Martha's tears needed company rather than comment, and after a while she leaned, just slightly, into the solid warmth of him. Spring came slow, and then all at once the way it does in that country, and with it came a kind of settledness to the farmhouse that none of them spoke of directly but all of them felt, the particular unremarkable peace of a household that has stopped waiting for the next blow to fall. Daniel's anger had not vanished. Martha did not think it ever entirely would. Not the kind of anger built from losing a mother before he was old enough to understand what losing meant, but it had softened into something more like ordinary boyish orneriness. And one evening at supper, when Sarah teased him about the size of the fish he'd failed to catch that afternoon, he retorted with a joke so dry and unexpected that the whole table erupted into laughter, Thomas loudest of all, and Martha realized, watching him laugh with his whole chest for what she suspected was the first time in 2 years. That healing did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, but as an accumulation of small ordinary ones, stacked one on top of the other, until one day you looked up and found yourself standing in a different life than the one you'd been living in grief. It was Thomas who spoke first in the end, on an evening in late April, when the last of the planting was done, and the whole family had gathered on the porch to watch the sun go down over the north pasture, the same pasture where he had once stood soaked to the skin, with nothing left to offer but a question he'd been afraid to ask. The children had gone in to bed, Sarah shepherding the younger ones with her usual quiet authority, and Martha and Thomas sat alone in the deepening blue light, and he began, as he often did, a sentence he did not finish, "I have been wanting to say," and stopped, the old tick, the vulnerable half of the thought retreating before it could be spoken. Martha, who had learned by then not to let him hide there, said gently that she had noticed he did that, started toward something, and then backed away from it before it could cost him anything. And she asked him, plain, the way she asked everything, what it was he kept almost saying. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands the way he had that first rainy day at the fence, and then he said that he had walked 300 miles believing he had nothing left to offer anyone, that he had come to her door prepared to trade labor for shelter and expected nothing more than that narrow, transactional mercy. And that instead. She had given his children a home and given him, though he had not asked for it and had not believed he deserved it, something that felt dangerously close to a second life. He said he was afraid to want more than that, because wanting more and losing it had broken him once already, and he did not know if he could survive that particular grief twice. Martha listened to all of this without interrupting, and when he finished, she reached over and took the hat gently out of his hands, the way you might take a thing from someone so they have nothing left to hide behind. And she said that she understood the fear better than he might guess, because she had spent 2 years building a rule around her own heart to keep exactly this kind of hope from ever getting close enough to hurt her again. She said that she had broken her own rule for him without quite meaning to, somewhere between the rainy fence line and the porch rail in February, and that she was through pretending otherwise. She said, plain as anything she had ever said, that this was home for him and for the children, not because he had earned it with 4 months of labor, but because a home was not a thing you earned, it was a thing you were given by people who had chosen you, and she had chosen him weeks ago without ever meaning to. Thomas Hargrove, who had not cried in front of another living soul since the night his wife died, put his face in his hands on that porch and wept. And this time, Martha did not simply stand beside him. She pulled him against her. This big, careful, competent woman who had spent 2 years convinced that no one would ever again choose to lean on her. And she held him the way she had held his children through fever and grief and 300 miles of road. And when he finally lifted his head, he reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small object he had been carrying, unspoken for weeks, a plain tin cup, dented and worn. The cup Anna had used every morning of their marriage, and he pressed it into Martha's hands and told her that he did not have a ring to offer. Not yet, not with the little he had, but that he wanted her to have the one thing he had carried through every mile of the worst year of his life. Because it seemed right that the woman who had given his family a home should hold the last piece of the one they'd lost. Martha closed her hands around the cup and around his hands both, and she said that she would keep it safe, the way she kept her promises always, and that this was not a small thing to say from a woman who had learned the hard way not to promise anything she wasn't certain she could keep. Word of the engagement moved through the county in the particular electric way that good news travels through places accustomed mostly to bad, and it reached inevitably the ears of Mrs. Bucks, Cordelia Pruitt, who arrived once more at the farmhouse door, though this time without her basket of preserves and without her earlier confidence, because in the month since her first visit, the town's opinion of Martha Coyle had shifted in ways Mrs. Pruitt had not anticipated and could not entirely reverse. It was her own housekeeper, in fact, a quiet woman named Beatrice, who had worked in the Pruitt household for 11 years and had watched Cordelia's cruelties accumulate in silence for every one of them, who had finally spoken up first, telling anyone in town who would listen that she had seen with her own eyes the Hargrove children thriving, healthy and settled and loved, and that she for one was ashamed to have stayed silent so long, while her employer spread poison about a woman doing nothing but good in this county. Beatrice's testimony, delivered without dramatics, at the church social in front of a dozen witnesses, did more to turn opinion than anything Martha herself could have said, because it came from someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking it. Mrs. Pruitt, standing now on Martha's porch with considerably less certainty than she had carried 4 months before, attempted an apology so thin and self-serving that Martha almost laughed. Something about having only ever meant well, about concern being a hard thing to fully set aside even now, and Martha, who had earned by then the right to be generous, told her only that she hoped Mrs. Pruitt might find in the seasons ahead some concern to spare for people who actually needed it, and left it at that, because there was more satisfaction in a quiet dignity than in a loud victory. And Martha had learned, over 2 hard years, exactly how much a loud victory was worth. The wedding, when it came in June, was a small affair, held right there in the front pasture under a sky scrubbed clean by a week of good weather, with Silas Reeves standing as witness and Doc Bennett bringing his fiddle and half the county turning out despite the informality of the invitation, because word had gotten around as word does. About the widow and the farmhand and the 4 children who had walked 300 miles into a life nobody expected to find waiting for them. Sarah stood at Martha's side throughout, no longer managing anyone, simply present, simply a girl at a wedding, and when Martha caught her eye during the vows, Sarah was smiling in a way Martha had not seen on her face in all the months she'd known her. A smile with nothing held back behind it. Daniel stood beside his father, solemn and proud, in a borrowed jacket 2 sizes too large, and when the vows were finished, he was the first one to whoop loud enough to startle the horses, and everyone laughed, and the sound of it carried clear across the north pasture to the very fence line where this whole story had begun in the rain. Ellie stood close to Martha's skirts, holding a small carved bird she had finished only the night before, a bird with its wings spread wide instead of folded, and when the ceremony ended, she pressed it into Martha's hand without a word, though her eyes said everything that needed saying, and Martha understood it as the truest gift she had received all day. Jonah, walking steady now on his own 2 legs, toddled the length of the pasture during the vows and had to be retrieved twice, and Thomas, catching him up in his arms during the second retrieval. The laugh, the kind of full, unguarded laugh that Martha had come to recognize as the sound of a man who had finally set his grief down somewhere it could rest instead of carrying it every waking hour. Silas Reeves, called on to say a few words before the vows were spoken, looked out over the gathered crowd, the same crowd that 4 months earlier had stood on a boardwalk waiting to see a woman humiliated and had instead watched her win, and said that he had lived in this county longer than most of the people standing in it, and that he had seen a great many things in his years, fortunes made and lost, families broken and mended, but that he had rarely seen anything so plain and so true as what had happened on the Coyle place that winter, which was simply this, that a man had asked for work, and a woman who had every reason in the world to protect what little she had left had chosen, instead, to be generous with it, and that generosity, offered without calculation and without expectation of return, had built, out of 2 broken households, 1 whole one. He said that was as good a description of a marriage as he had ever managed to put into words, and he supposed it would do for this one too. Years later, and this part of the story belongs properly to Silas, who told it best, sitting on his own porch of an evening, with a grandchild or 2 gathered at his feet, long after the Coyle place had become known simply as the Hargrove farm, its fences mended, its herds doubled, its bunkhouse long since converted into a schoolroom for the children of families who had followed the Hargroves' example and found their own way into that county's good graces, years later. Silas would tell it like this, that he had stood on a boardwalk one cold spring morning and watched a banker try to take a woman's land out from under her because she had dared to be kind to a stranger, and that the woman had stood her ground and the stranger had stood beside her. And between the 2 of them, they had built something that had outlasted every small-hearted person who ever doubted it. He would say that the tin cup still sat on the mantel in the Hargrove kitchen, dented and worn and polished bright from years of careful handling, and that Ellie Hargrove, grown now and known through 3 counties for the fineness of her woodwork, still carved a bird every year on her mother Martha's birthday, wings spread wide, and left it on the windowsill the way she had the very first week she came to that farm, unable yet to speak, but never once unable to say what she meant. He would say that Sarah had gone on to run a household and a business of her own with the same fierce competence she had shown at 12, though she no longer carried it like armor, only like a gift she had chosen to keep. He would say that Daniel, whose anger had burned itself down at last into something steadier and warmer, had taken over the working of the land itself, and that he still, on occasion, told a joke, dry enough to startle a whole supper table into laughter, the way he had that first spring, when the worst of the grieving had finally loosened its grip. And he would say that Jonah, who had been too small to remember any of it, the rain, or the fence line, or the long walk that brought his family to that door, had grown up knowing only one version of home. The version that began, not with a rainy night of desperation, but with a woman's hand against his damp head, and a voice humming something low and wordless in the dark. And that perhaps that was the truest mercy of the whole story, that the child who had cried the loudest and the longest was the one who would never remember there had ever been anything to cry about. What Silas never quite managed to explain, though he tried every time he told it, was the plainest truth underneath all the rest, which was that home was never a place with 4 walls and a roof. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. It was a decision 2 people made, over and over in kitchens and barns and porch rails and hospital quiet sick rooms, to choose each other and choose the ones who came with them, not because the choosing was easy or safe or free of risk, but because the alternative, the guarded, rationed, careful life that asked nothing and risked nothing and therefore lost nothing, was no kind of life at all. A man had asked for farmhand work at a widow's gate in the pouring rain, and what he had received instead, what they had both received, without either of them quite intending it, was a family built out of the wreckage of 2 others, sturdier for having been broken once already, and mended with hands that knew exactly what the mending was worth. That, in the end, was the whole of the story. And it was, Silas always said, the only kind of story worth telling twice.